It is 2 in the morning, and a 19-year-old is lying on a cold bathroom floor, knees pulled to his chest, sweating through his shirt. The pain started near his belly button as a dull ache he could ignore. Then it crawled to the lower right side of his stomach and sharpened into something that made him afraid to move. By the time the headlights of the ambulance sweep across the ceiling, a surgeon he has never met is already scrubbing in. An hour later, a gloved hand lifts a small, worm-shaped tube out of his body and drops it into a metal tray. Everyone in that room believes the same thing about the thing in the tray. They believe it is useless. They believe it is a mistake the body made and finally paid for. They are wrong. And to understand why they are wrong, you have to leave that operating room and travel back millions of years into a world that no longer exists. That little tube is the appendix, and almost everything you have been told about it is a story from the 1800s that refuses to die. We call it a leftover, a spare part, a scrap of junk that evolution forgot to throw away. But the appendix is not the thing your body failed to delete. It is something your body fought to keep over and over again across tens of millions of years. It is not the mistake in the story, it is the survivor. And it is inside you right now, quietly holding a secret about who your ancestors were and the brutal world they had to survive. So here is what we are going to do. We are going to answer 3 questions that most people never even think to ask. Where did this strange tube actually come from? Why does evolution keep building it again and again when it seems so eager to erase it? And if it is so useful, why does it still sometimes try to kill the person carrying it? Hold on to those questions. The answers rewrite everything. Let us start at the beginning, not with the appendix, but with the gut it grew out of. Imagine one of your distant ancestors, long before anything you would recognize as human. This creature is a leaf eater, and leaves are a miserable way to make a living. They are wrapped in cellulose, a fiber so tough that almost no animal can break it down on its own. A mouthful of leaves is like a mouthful of tiny green suits of armor. To survive on that, an animal needs help, and the help comes from inside. That help is a vast crowd of microbes living in a specialized chamber of the gut called the cecum. Picture a giant fermentation tank tucked into the belly, packed with trillions of tiny workers whose only job is to slowly rot tough plant fiber into something the body can actually absorb. The bigger the tank, the more leaves you can survive on. You can still see this ancient bargain playing out today. Look at a koala. It lives on eucalyptus leaves so full of poison that they would sicken almost any other animal. And it pulls off that impossible diet using a cecum that can stretch longer than the koala is tall. A huge fermentation chamber is what a body builds when leaves are the only thing on the menu. To really feel this, picture the world those ancestors woke up in every single morning. Dense forest, tens of millions of years deep, long before fire, before cooking, before a single sharpened stone. Every meal had to be won raw, and almost every meal fought back, bristling with fiber and bitter chemical defenses. In a world like that, a big gut full of hungry microbes was not a luxury. It was the only engine that could turn a forest of armor-plated leaves into a living, breathing animal. For a very long time, that was the story of our ancestors, too. Big gut, big cecum, endless salad. And then, somewhere along our line, the menu changed. What happens to a fermentation tank when you stop eating leaves? That is the next turn in the story, and it is where the appendix is born. Over countless generations, our ancestors drifted toward richer food. Fruit, roots, insects, eventually meat. This new food was softer, denser, and far easier to break down. It gave back more energy for less effort, and it no longer required a massive vat of microbes working around the clock. And here is the quiet cruelty of evolution. A big organ is expensive. It costs blood, it costs energy, it costs room in a crowded body. The moment the giant cecum stopped paying for itself, it became a liability, and generation by generation, it shrank. Later, our ancestors found an even greater shortcut. They learned to prepare food outside the body, first by pounding and slicing it, and eventually by cooking it over fire. Cooking is like doing part of your digestion before the food ever reaches your stomach. It breaks down tough fibers and unlocks energy that raw meals keep locked away. With that shortcut, the case for a giant fermentation tank collapsed almost entirely. The gut could afford to get smaller, the jaw could afford to get weaker, and the body quietly redirected the energy it saved into something far more expensive and far more useful: a swelling brain. The organ that once defined survival was being dismantled to help pay for the mind reading these words. But the cecum did not vanish completely. At the very tip of that shrinking chamber, a narrow, dead-end remnant was left behind. A thin tube hanging off the gut like the last inch of a deflated balloon. That remnant is your appendix. So the first answer is finally clear. Where did it come from? It is the surviving tip of a great fermentation organ your leaf-eating ancestors once could not live without. It is a souvenir of a vanished diet, still folded inside you, right now. And this is exactly the point where the famous mistake was made. In 1871, Charles Darwin looked at that shrunken little tube and told a story that sounded perfect. The appendix, he reasoned, was the useless leftover of that lost organ, a part on its slow way to disappearing entirely. Smaller, pointless, fading. For almost 100 years that verdict stood, because it explained the size and the apparent uselessness in one clean stroke. It felt airtight. But a good detective does not stop at the confession that sounds convenient, and hanging off the edge of Darwin's tidy story was a loose thread that, once you pull it, unravels the whole thing. Here is that thread. If the appendix is truly a fading leftover, then evolution should be quietly deleting it. That is what happens to parts we no longer need. They shrink, they grow rarer, they wink out. Fading things fade. So biologists did something simple, and it turned out devastating. They built a huge family tree of mammals and marked every branch that has an appendix and every branch that does not. If Darwin was right, the appendix should appear in just one or two old lineages and then slowly disappear among their descendants, like a candle burning down. That is not what they found. Not even close. The appendix has evolved independently more than 30 separate times across the mammal family tree. Rabbits have one, some rodents have one, certain primates have one. These are branches that split apart tens of millions of years ago, and each one, on its own, invented the same little dead-end tube. And now here is the part that should make the hair on your arm stand up. Once a lineage gains an appendix, it almost never loses it again. Think about what that means. Evolution is not throwing this organ away. It keeps reaching for it, in lineage after lineage, and once it has it, it holds on with a grip that borders on stubborn. Read that pattern again, because it is the exact opposite of what a leftover is supposed to do. A dying part shows up once and quietly slips away. This one shows up everywhere, independently, and then clings on for dear life. Imagine the researchers standing back from that finished chart, braced to see a single fading spark near the bottom. Instead, the whole tree lit up. You do not reinvent the same tool more than 30 times by accident. You reinvent it because it works. And just like that, the entire mystery flips. The question is no longer, why do we still carry this useless thing? The question is far more unsettling. What is this tube doing that is so valuable nature refuses to let it go, even when keeping it can cost a life? To answer that, we have to stop looking at the appendix from the outside and zoom in until it stops looking like a tube and starts looking like a fortress. Because it is packed. The appendix is one of the most crowded neighborhoods of immune tissue in your entire body, studded with dense clusters of cells that manufacture and train the soldiers that fight infection. That is a strange amount of security to post at the door of a supposedly abandoned building. Armies do not guard ruins. They guard something worth protecting. So the real question becomes simple and eerie. What is living behind that heavily guarded door? The answer is that your gut is not empty, and it is not only yours. It is home to trillions of bacteria, and most of them are not enemies. They are allies. They break down your food, they make vitamins your own body cannot, and they crowd out the dangerous microbes that would love to move in and take over. By raw cell count, you are less a single animal and more a walking ecosystem, a colony that thinks it is a person. That community is one of the most important things keeping you alive. And any ecosystem that valuable needs a plan for the day disaster strikes. In 2007, a team of researchers at Duke University asked the question nobody had bothered to ask out loud. What happens to that inner ecosystem when catastrophe hits? Because for almost all of human history, catastrophe hit constantly. A bad meal, a mouthful of dirty water, a passing plague, any of them could turn your gut into a raging flood. Diseases like cholera and dysentery do exactly that. They blast the entire contents of your intestines out of your body in a matter of hours, and they sweep your good bacteria out with everything else. In the ancient world, that was a death sentence written in 2 acts. First, the illness itself nearly kills you. Then, even if you somehow survive, your gut is left a scorched and empty field, wide open for the next hostile invader to colonize before your allies can crawl back. Picture one of your ancestors living through that, in a world with no medicine and no clean water. The fever finally breaks. The worst seems over. And then, days later, a second infection slips into that emptied gut and finishes what the first one started. For most of human history, that grim second act was the difference between recovering and never getting up again. Unless, the Duke team proposed, you had a backup, a safe house. This is the reveal that changes the whole picture. The appendix, they argued, is a bunker for your bacteria. Look again at its shape, the shape everyone dismissed as pointless. It is a narrow tube with a dead end, sitting just off the main highway of the gut. When a purging illness scours your intestines clean, that flood roars straight down the main channel and rushes past the little side pocket. And tucked safely inside that pocket, protected by all that immune tissue standing guard, a reserve population of your good microbes rides out the storm. Then, when the danger is past and the flood is gone, they stream back out and reseed the wasteland. They rebuild your inner ecosystem from a saved copy. The appendix is not a leftover at all. It is a reboot disk for your gut. Suddenly, every strange detail snaps into focus. The immune fortress makes sense. The useless dead-end shape makes sense. And more than 30 independent reinventions make sense, because a backup system for the ecosystem that keeps you alive is exactly the kind of thing evolution would build again and again and refuse to surrender. This is your ancestry, still switched on inside you, still holding that reserve, right now. Which drops us into the darkest corner of the story. If this tube is so useful, why does it turn on us? Why did it try to kill that 19-year-old on the bathroom floor? Appendicitis is not some rare freak event. Somewhere between 5 and 9 of every 100 people will have their appendix inflame and threaten to rupture at some point in their lives. Before surgery existed, a burst appendix meant infection spilling across the abdomen, and that was very often the end. So we are left with a genuinely brutal paradox, a survival organ that regularly commits murder. The most likely answer is one of the strangest twists in modern medicine, and it points a finger straight back at us. Look at where appendicitis strikes hardest. It is far more common in wealthy, industrialized, spotlessly clean nations than in places with fewer sanitized surfaces and more everyday exposure to microbes. That pattern is a clue, and it fits the safe house idea disturbingly well. The appendix was built for a world drowning in bacteria, a world where its bunker was constantly full, constantly cycling microbes in and out, constantly busy doing its job. Our modern world scrubbed all of that away. Clean water, sealed food, soap, and antibiotics gave us a gut that rarely gets flushed, and a safe house that rarely gets used. And an immune outpost with nothing to do, guarding a chamber that no longer cycles, appears to be more likely to overreact, to swell, to block, and to ignite. Picture a fire station built for a city that used to burn every week. Take away the fires, seal the crew inside with nothing to fight, and one day the building itself catches. The appendix is probably not malfunctioning because it is useless. It is malfunctioning, in part, because we made its ancient job disappear. There is one last piece of evidence, and it is the quietest and most convincing of all. If the appendix truly is a bacterial backup, then people who lose it should struggle a little harder to rebuild their gut after it gets wiped out. And that is what some studies suggest. People without an appendix appear to be several times more likely to suffer a return of a nasty gut infection called Clostridioides difficile, the kind that flares again and again precisely because the good bacteria cannot get a foothold. No reboot disc, a harder reboot. It is not proof of everything, and honest scientists still argue the edges of this. But it is a fingerprint left at exactly the scene the theory predicted. So walk back into that operating room with me, and look at the little tube in the metal tray one more time. When we started, everyone in that room knew what it was. A mistake. A useless scrap that finally showed its true colors by trying to kill a teenager. But that was never the truth. What the surgeon lifted out was not a design flaw. It was a survival tool, shaped over tens of millions of years, reinvented again and again because it kept our ancestors alive through a world of plagues and poisoned water we can barely imagine today. The 19-year-old will be perfectly fine without it. And that is only because he lives in the very world that made his appendix misfire. He does not need the bunker anymore. But he was still born carrying it, because you cannot delete millions of years of survival in a single clean century. His body is not out of date. It is just honest. It still remembers the world it was built for. That is the part worth sitting with. The appendix is not proof that your body is junk. It is proof that your body is a story. One written for a world that no longer exists, still folded quietly inside you. You are carrying a backup drive for an ancient ecosystem, a fire station for fires we finally put out, a small tube that once stood between your ancestors and the grave. Not useless, just early, just waiting in a world that forgot what it was ever for. So the next time someone tells you the appendix is a mistake, you will know better. It is not the leftover. It is the survivor. And if you want to keep pulling on these threads hidden inside your own body, the parts that make you strange, the parts that make you human, stick around. There is a lot more of you left to explain.